The wedding dress was still white when they pulled it from the creek. That's what Deputy Morris told the dispatcher at 3:47 a.m. on Halloween night, his voice shaking so badly they almost couldn't understand him. The dress was white, he said. Perfectly white, like it had just come from the store. But Sarah Cartwright had been dead for 6 months. If you've ever lived in a quiet town like Millbrook Falls, you know how one strange call can wake up an entire county. By dawn, there were 7 patrol cars parked along Creek Road, their lights painting the fog red and blue, and every single person who drove past slowed down to stare at the team of officers standing in the water, looking at something none of them could quite explain. The dress wasn't the only thing they found. There was a bouquet of white roses, fresh enough that the petals were still soft. There was a pearl necklace tangled in the reeds, and there was a single white heel, size 7, with mud on the toe but no wear on the sole. Like someone had put it on for the first time and walked exactly 3 steps before the earth opened up and swallowed her whole. Sarah Cartwright had died on April 19th. Car accident on Route 22, just past the old Hanson farm, where the road curves and the cell signal drops to nothing. She'd been driving back from her final dress fitting in the city 3 weeks before her wedding day. The truck that hit her ran a stop sign. The driver said he never saw her. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was gone. They buried her in that dress, the one her grandmother had worn, the one that cost more than most people in Millbrook Falls made in a month. Her fiancé, Michael Preston, stood at the gravesite in his suit, the same suit he was supposed to wear when he married her, and he didn't cry. He just stared at the casket like he was waiting for her to knock from the inside and tell him it was all a terrible joke. Tell me if this sounds familiar. That one person in your town everyone whispers about after something goes wrong. That's what Michael became. He stopped going to work at his father's hardware store, stopped answering his phone. His truck would be seen at odd hours, parked on the side of roads with no houses, no stores, nothing but trees and darkness. People said he was looking for something. Some said he was looking for her. His mother told anyone who would listen that he was fine, just grieving, just working through it in his own way. But mothers always say that, don't they? Even when they know it isn't true. The morning they found the dress, Michael's truck was parked at the cemetery. Sheriff Hutchins drove out there himself, found Michael sitting on the ground in front of Sarah's grave, his back against the headstone, his eyes closed. The sheriff asked him when he'd last been to Creek Road. Michael said he hadn't been there since high school, since the summer kids used to swim in the bend where the water runs slow and cold. The sheriff asked him if he knew anything about a wedding dress. Michael opened his eyes then, and the sheriff said later that he'd never seen a man look so empty and so terrified at the same time. What would you have done if someone you loved died, and then their things started appearing in places they shouldn't be? Would you think it was a sick prank? Or would some small part of you wonder if maybe, just maybe, death wasn't as final as everyone says? The story spread through Millbrook Falls, the way stories do in small towns, fast and twisted, changing shape with every person who told it. By noon, half the town was saying Sarah's grave had been robbed. By dinner, the other half was saying someone had seen her walking down Maple Street in her wedding dress, pale as paper, looking for the church. The grocery store clerk swore she'd heard the wedding march playing from the old Presbyterian church at midnight, even though the church had been locked up tight since Reverend Daniels retired and moved to Florida. The high school kids started daring each other to go to the cemetery after dark. No one took the dare. Michael didn't come home that night. His mother called the sheriff at 10 p.m., her voice high and thin with panic. They found his truck at 4 in the morning, parked outside the Rosewood event barn, the place where the wedding was supposed to happen. The place Sarah had spent months decorating in her mind, choosing flowers and colors and the exact way the lights would hang from the rafters. The door to the barn was open. Inside, someone had set up chairs in neat rows, facing a makeshift altar made from hay bales and old wooden pallets. There were candles everywhere, hundreds of them, burned down to nothing but puddles of wax. And in the center of it all, there was a dress form, the kind seamstresses use, draped in a white wedding dress, not the dress from the creek. A different one, older, yellowed with age. And when Sheriff Hutchins got close enough to read the tag sewn into the collar, his stomach dropped. The tag had a name embroidered in faded blue thread. Catherine Marsh, married 1952. Catherine Marsh had been Sarah's grandmother, the woman who'd originally worn the dress Sarah was buried in. Catherine had died in 1994, 2 years before Sarah was born. The dress she'd worn at her wedding had been donated to the Historical Society after she passed, placed in a glass case in the town museum along with her wedding. Photos and a small plaque that told the story of how she'd married her sweetheart 3 days after he came home from the war. The museum had been closed for renovations since June. When Sheriff Hutchins called the director, a woman named Pauline, who'd run the place for 30 years, she went down to check the case herself. She called back 20 minutes later. The dress was gone. The case had been opened from the inside, she said, which didn't make any sense because the case was locked and only she had the key. But the glass wasn't broken. The lock wasn't forced. It was like someone had simply reached through the case and taken it. If this happened in your town, would you believe it? Or would you do what most people do and find a rational explanation? Tell yourself it's kids playing pranks or someone with too much time and a sick sense of humor. But rational explanations started falling apart when they found the photographs. Someone had left them on the steps of the sheriff's office in a manila envelope with no return address and no postage. Just the word truth written on the front in careful slanted handwriting. Inside were 12 Polaroids, the kind that develop right in your hand. The kind no one uses anymore unless they're trying to feel nostalgic or they're trying to hide something digital cameras would record. The first photo showed Sarah's grave at sunset. Fresh flowers on the headstone. Everything normal. The second photo showed the same grave an hour later, the sky darker, and the earth in front of the stone looked disturbed. Loose. Like something had pushed up from underneath. The third photo made Deputy Morris leave the room. It showed the grave at night, and there was a hand reaching up from the soil. A woman's hand, pale, slender, wearing an engagement ring with a single diamond that caught the camera flash like a tiny star. The rest of the photos showed a figure walking through town. Blurred, like the camera couldn't quite focus, but unmistakably a woman in a white dress. She was walking down Maple Street in one photo, standing outside the hardware store in another, sitting on the bench outside the diner in a third. In every single photo, her face was turned away from the camera. In every single photo, she was alone. And in the final photo, she was standing in front of Michael Preston's house, one hand raised to the door like she was about to knock. The timestamp on that photo was October 31st, 2:17 a.m. Michael's mother had called the police 4 hours later to report him missing. There's always that one person who says they saw something that night. In Millbrook Falls, it was Eddie Carver, the night shift manager at the 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. Eddie had worked that shift for 15 years and prided himself on remembering every single person who came through, every car, every odd occurrence. He told Sheriff Hutchins that a woman in a wedding dress had come into the store at 2:45 a.m. She didn't say anything, didn't buy anything, just walked between the aisles slowly, running her fingers along the shelves, and then walked back out. Eddie said he'd called out to her, asked if she needed help, but she didn't turn around. He said her hair was long and dark and wet, like she'd just come out of the water. He said when she walked past the security camera by the door, the screen went to static. They pulled the footage. Eddie was right. At 2:44 a.m., the camera showed the empty store. Eddie behind the counter reading a magazine. At 2:45, the screen dissolved into grey and white noise. At 2:51, the camera came back on. Eddie was still behind the counter, but now he was standing up, staring at the door, his face pale. The timestamp showed 6 minutes had passed. Eddie swore it felt like 30 seconds. Sheriff Hutchins organized a search party. 40 volunteers, some from town, some from the county over. All of them walking grid patterns through the woods and fields around Millbrook Falls, calling Michael's name into the cold October air. They searched for 3 days. They found his jacket near the creek, the same place they'd found the dress. They found a trail of white rose petals leading from the cemetery to the event barn. They found candle wax on the church steps and muddy footprints that stopped in the middle of the road, just stopped, like whoever made them had simply vanished into the air. On the 4th day, November 3rd, they found Michael. He was standing in the middle of the Rosewood event barn, wearing his wedding suit, the same one from the funeral. He was staring at the makeshift altar, his hands at his sides, his face blank. When Sheriff Hutchins called his name, Michael didn't respond. When the paramedics checked him over, they said he was physically fine. No injuries, no signs of exposure or dehydration. But his eyes didn't focus. He didn't speak. He just stood there. And when they tried to move him, he started crying, silent tears that ran down his face while his expression never changed. They took him to county medical, ran tests, found nothing wrong. A psychiatrist from the city came down to evaluate him. She spent 2 hours in his room and came out looking shaken. She told Sheriff Hutchins that Michael kept saying the same thing over and over. He kept saying, "She's waiting. She's still waiting. I have to go back." The psychiatrist said it was a psychotic break brought on by grief and guilt. She said he needed time and medication and therapy. She said people don't just come back from the dead, that everything they'd found could be explained by sleepwalking, by Michael's own deteriorating mental state, by his subconscious trying to finish something that had been violently interrupted. She said it made sense psychologically. She said it was tragic but treatable. She said all of this while standing in the hospital hallway under fluorescent lights that flickered every few seconds. She said it with confidence, with authority, with years of education backing up every word. But Sheriff Hutchins noticed that her hands were shaking when she handed him her report. He noticed that she left town that same afternoon and never came back, even though the hospital called her 6 times to follow up on Michael's case. What do you think happened during those 2 hours? What do you think Michael told her that made a woman with a decade of psychiatric experience pack her bags and refuse to return? Michael was released after a week. His mother took him home, set him up in his old bedroom, the one with the posters from high school still on the walls and the trophies from track meets gathering dust on the shelf. She made him soup. She sat with him. She told him everything was going to be okay, and Michael nodded and ate his soup and stared out the window at the street, watching, always watching, like he was waiting for someone to walk up the driveway. November in Millbrook Falls felt different that year. The leaves had all fallen early, leaving the trees bare and skeletal against a sky that stayed gray from morning to night. The Halloween decorations came down, but people didn't put up their Thanksgiving wreaths. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to finish that had started on that cold October night. When they pulled a wedding dress from the creek and everything that made sense began to unravel, Michael started talking again in mid-November. Just small things at first, yes, no, thank you. His mother cried with relief. His father, who'd been silent through the whole ordeal, gripping his coffee cup at the kitchen table every morning like it was the only solid thing left in the world, finally went back to opening the hardware store. Life tried to return to normal, but normal had changed shape, become something that fit wrong, like wearing someone else's shoes. Michael went back to work. He restocked shelves, helped customers, rang up purchases, all with that same blank expression that never quite reached his eyes. People tried to be kind. They didn't ask questions. They didn't bring up Sarah or the dress or the 3 days he'd been missing. Small towns know when to leave things alone, when to let silence do the work that words would only make worse. But they watched him. Everyone watched him. And they noticed that every day at 2:45 p.m., Michael would stop whatever he was doing and stand completely still for exactly 6 minutes, staring at nothing, his lips moving like he was having a conversation with someone no one else could see. If you've ever known someone who came back from something they won't talk about, you know that look, that distance. Like part of them is still wherever they were, still living in that moment they can't escape. The photographs kept appearing, one every few days, always in the same manila envelope, always with that same handwriting on the front. The sheriff stopped opening them after the fifth one. He locked them in his desk drawer and tried to forget they existed. But Deputy Morris had seen what was inside before the drawer closed. He saw photos of Michael standing at Sarah's grave at midnight. Photos of the church with all its lights on even though the power had been shut off. Photos of white rose petals arranged in patterns on the ground. Patterns that looked almost like words if you stared at them long enough. And one photo, the one that made Deputy Morris start sleeping with his lights on, showed two figures standing in front of the Rosewood event barn. One was clearly Michael, his face visible in the camera flash. The other was a woman in white, her back to the camera, her hand reaching out to take his. Tell me honestly, would you look at a photo like that and tell yourself it was doctored? Would you convince yourself it was Photoshop, or a double exposure, or someone playing an elaborate hoax? Or would you feel that cold certainty in your gut that some things can't be explained away, no matter how hard you try? The Historical Society director, Pauline, started having dreams. She told her sister about them over coffee at the diner, her voice low enough that the waitress had to lean in to hear. She dreamed about Catherine Marsh, the woman whose dress had been taken from the museum. In the dreams, Catherine was young again, 23 years old, standing in her wedding dress in a church filled with people. But the church was wrong, Pauline said. The pews were rotting, the windows were broken, and everyone in the congregation was dead, their faces grey, their eyes empty. All of them watching Catherine walk down the aisle toward a groom who stood with his back turned, waiting. Pauline's sister laughed it off, said it was stress, said the whole town was on edge, and dreams were just dreams, just the brain processing fear and confusion. But Pauline didn't laugh. She stirred her coffee and stared out the window at the street and said, "In the dream, Catherine turns around right before she reaches the altar, and she looks directly at me, and she says, 'Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I didn't know.'" Her sister asked who Catherine was talking about. Pauline said, "Sarah, she's talking about Sarah." The connection between Catherine and Sarah wasn't obvious at first. Catherine had died before Sarah was born. They'd never met. But when Pauline went digging through the Historical Society's archives, searching through boxes of old documents and photographs that hadn't been touched in decades, she found something that made her hands go cold. She found Catherine's diary, a small leather-bound book that had been donated along with the dress, tucked away in a box labeled Marsh Family. Miscellaneous, the diary entries were mundane for the most part. Daily life in 1952, grocery lists, weather observations, comments about neighbors and church socials. But the entries from the week before Catherine's wedding were different. They were frantic, the handwriting slanted and rushed, words crossed out and rewritten. Catherine wrote about dreams she was having, dreams of a church that wasn't quite right, dreams of walking down an aisle towards something she couldn't see. And in the final entry, dated May 2nd, 1952, 2 days before her wedding, Catherine wrote, "I saw her today, the woman in white. She was standing at the end of Maple Street watching my house. Mother says I'm just nervous, that all brides get anxious before the wedding, but I know what I saw. She looked like me, exactly like me, but older, sadder, and when I blinked she was gone. Catherine Marsh married Joseph Marsh on May 4th, 1952. The ceremony went off without incident. The reception was held at the town hall, and everyone said it was the loveliest wedding Millbrook Falls had ever seen. Catherine and Joseph had 3 children, lived in the same house on Oak Street for 40 years, and by all accounts had a happy, unremarkable life. Catherine died of a stroke in 1994, surrounded by family, and was buried in the town cemetery 3 plots away from where Sarah would be buried 30 years later. 3 plots away, close enough to see each other's headstones. Close enough that if you stood at one grave, you could reach out and almost touch the other. What would you have done if you found that diary? Would you show it to someone, or would you put it back in the box and try to forget what it said? Pauline showed it to Sheriff Hutchins. He read it 3 times, standing in the Historical Society's back room, surrounded by boxes of the past, and then he asked Pauline if anyone else knew about this. She said no. He told her to keep it that way. He took the diary with him, said it was evidence, though evidence of what he couldn't say. That night, the sheriff sat in his office until well past midnight, reading the diary over and over, trying to make the pieces fit into a shape that made sense. He'd been sheriff of Millbrook Falls for 22 years. He'd seen deaths and disappearances, accidents and crimes, all the dark things that happen even in small towns where everyone thinks they know everyone else. But he'd never seen anything like this. He'd never had to consider that maybe time wasn't as linear as he'd always believed, that maybe some events cast shadows backward as well as forward, that maybe Sarah had been seeing Catherine the same way Catherine had been seeing Sarah, both of them trapped in something that transcended the simple rules of life and death. His phone rang at 1:30 a.m. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick it up. The voice on the other end was Michael's mother, and she was crying so hard he could barely understand her. He caught enough. Michael was gone again. His bedroom window was open. His shoes were by the bed. He'd walked out into the November night in his bare feet, wearing nothing but his pajamas, and she'd watched from her own window as he walked down the driveway, down the street, disappearing into the darkness like he was being pulled by invisible strings. The sheriff called in every deputy. They searched all night. They searched the cemetery, the creek, the event barn, every place Michael had been found before. Nothing. As dawn broke, grey and cold, they expanded the search, combing through the woods that bordered the town, calling his name until their voices went hoarse. And that's when Deputy Morris found the footprints. They were in the mud near the creek, 2 sets of them, walking side by side. One set was larger, clearly a man's bare feet, the prints deep and evenly spaced. The other set was smaller, delicate, the prints shallow, like whoever made them barely weighed anything at all. The prints led along the creek bank, following the water upstream, away from town, into the part of the woods where the trees grew thick and the sunlight never quite reached the ground. They followed the prints for a mile, 2 miles, 3. The prints never wavered, never stopped, just kept walking deeper into the woods with that strange, steady rhythm. And then suddenly they ended. Not at a road or a clearing or any logical stopping point. They just ended in the middle of a small grove of birch trees, the white bark peeling like skin, the ground covered in old leaves that showed no other signs of disturbance. If this happened in your town, would you keep searching? Would you call it quits and hope he turned up somewhere safe? Or would you stand in that grove of trees with the wind moving through the branches and feel deep in your bones that something had taken him somewhere you couldn't follow? They searched for 5 more days. Volunteers came from 3 counties over. They brought dogs, heat sensors, drones with cameras. They found nothing. No trace, no clues. Michael Preston had simply walked into the woods and vanished. And the only evidence he'd ever been there were those footprints in the mud, walking alongside someone who left barely any impression at all. Michael's mother stopped sleeping. She'd sit in his room, surrounded by his things, waiting for him to come home. His father stopped talking entirely, just went through the motions of living like a man underwater. The town held a vigil at the church, hundreds of people holding candles, praying for Michael's safe return, though most of them knew in their hearts they were really saying goodbye. December came to Millbrook Falls with the first real snow, thick and heavy, covering everything in white silence. The search for Michael Preston was officially suspended. The case remained open, but resources were allocated elsewhere, to newer emergencies, to problems that still had solutions. Life moved on the way it always does, even when part of you wants to stay frozen in the moment before everything fell apart. But some people couldn't let it go. Deputy Morris spent his off-duty hours in the woods, walking the same paths they'd searched, looking for something everyone else had missed. Pauline catalogued every item in the Historical Society, checking and rechecking, making sure nothing else had gone missing. And Michael's mother kept his room exactly as it was, kept the window open even in the cold. just in case he found his way back and needed to climb through. The photographs stopped coming after Michael disappeared. The manila envelope stopped appearing on the sheriff's doorstep. It was like whatever had been documenting the events decided the story was finished, or maybe that the final chapter wasn't meant to be photographed. Sheriff Hutchins kept the photos locked in his desk drawer, and sometimes late at night he'd take them out and spread them on his desk, trying to see a pattern, trying to understand what they were supposed to mean. But the photos stayed silent, just frozen moments of something that defied explanation. On December 20th, a hiker found something in the woods. Not Michael, something else. The hiker, a man from the city who was passing through on his way to visit family, had taken a detour off the main trail, drawn by what he said was the strangest feeling, like something was calling to him, like he was meant to find whatever was there waiting. He found a small clearing, perfectly circular, where the snow hadn't fallen. The ground was bare, covered in white rose petals, thousands of them, arranged in concentric circles. And in the center of the circles was a wedding veil, old and delicate, spread out on the ground like someone had just removed it and set it down carefully. Preserving its shape, the hiker took photos with his phone, called the local authorities and waited. When Deputy Morris arrived, he stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, not moving, barely breathing. He recognized the veil. He'd seen it in the photos from the museum. It had been part of Catherine Marsh's wedding outfit, displayed alongside the dress in the glass case. The museum director had never reported it missing because she'd never thought to check. The dress was gone, so she'd assumed everything in the case was gone. But the veil had been there all along, waiting until this exact moment to disappear and reappear in a place that felt removed from normal geography, from normal time. Deputy Morris called Sheriff Hutchins. They stood together in the clearing, two men who'd spent their lives believing in facts and evidence and rational explanations, and they admitted quietly that they had no idea what they were looking at. The rose petals were fresh. In December, in snow, the veil was clean, untouched by weather or animals or decay. And when they bagged it as evidence and tried to leave the clearing, they both felt it, that pull. That sense that something wanted them to stay, to wait, to witness whatever came next. They didn't stay. They left quickly, walking faster than they meant to, and neither of them spoke about the fear that walked with them back to the patrol car. Fear that had nothing to do with danger or violence and everything to do with the realization that the world was stranger and larger and less knowable than they'd ever imagined. There's always that one person who says they saw something that night. In Millbrook Falls, as December turned toward Christmas and the town tried to remember how to celebrate, how to hang lights and sing carols and pretend everything was normal, that person was Father Mackenzie, the priest who'd taken over at the Presbyterian Church after it reopened in November. Father Mackenzie was young, new to Millbrook Falls, and he'd heard all the stories but had dismissed them the way educated people dismiss local legends. Until December 24th, Christmas Eve, when he was locking up the church after midnight mass and saw two people standing at the altar. He thought at first they were congregants who'd stayed behind to pray, but as he walked down the aisle toward them, he realized they weren't moving, weren't breathing. Were just standing there side by side, holding hands. The man was wearing a dark suit. The woman was wearing a wedding dress, the white fabric glowing in the candlelight. And as Father Mackenzie got closer, close enough to see their faces, he stopped walking. It was Michael Preston. Father Mackenzie had seen his photo in the news, on the missing person flyers that still hung on telephone poles around town. And standing next to Michael, her hand in his, her face peaceful and beautiful and terribly sad, was a woman Father Mackenzie didn't recognize, but somehow knew immediately was Sarah Cartwright. Father Mackenzie said later that he tried to speak, tried to ask if they needed help, tried to do something, anything, but his voice wouldn't work. He just stood there, 10 feet away from two people who shouldn't exist, and watched as they turned to look at him. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that holds 1,000 unsaid words, and then she looked back at Michael. She said something Father Mackenzie couldn't hear. Michael nodded. And together, still holding hands, they walked toward the back of the church, toward the door that led out into the cold December night. Father Mackenzie followed them. He had to. Later, he couldn't explain why, couldn't say what compelled him to move, but he followed them out of the church into the snow that had started falling, and watched as they walked down the church steps, across the parking lot, and into the cemetery that bordered the church grounds. The cemetery was empty and silent, the headstones like small white mountains under the snow. Michael and Sarah walked between the graves with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. They walked until they reached Sarah's grave, and there they stopped. Sarah released Michael's hand. She knelt down in the snow, her wedding dress spreading around her like wings, and she touched her own headstone, tracing the letters of her name with one finger. Father Mackenzie heard her speak, her voice carrying across the snowy silence. She said, "I'm sorry I was late." Michael knelt beside her. He said, "You're not late." I waited, and Sarah said, "I know. That's why I could come back." They stayed like that for a moment, two people kneeling in the snow beside a grave, and then Sarah stood. She took Michael's hand again, and together they walked 3 plots over to Catherine Marsh's grave. The headstone there was older, the letters worn by decades of weather, but still readable in the moonlight that broke through the clouds. Sarah touched Catherine's headstone the same way she'd touched her own. She whispered something Father Mackenzie couldn't hear, and then, as he watched, both Sarah and Michael began to fade. Not disappear, fade, like they were becoming transparent, like reality was remembering they didn't belong there anymore, and was gently, inevitably, pulling them back to wherever they were supposed to be. Father Mackenzie called out. He ran toward them, his feet slipping in the snow. But by the time he reached the graves, they were gone, completely. He stood there alone, breathing hard, his heart hammering, and looked down at the snow where they'd been kneeling. There were impressions there, faint, shallow, like someone had knelt in the snow hours ago, and the wind had almost but not quite erased the evidence. He also found something else. Lying in the snow between Sarah's grave and Catherine's grave was a wedding ring. Simple gold band, no engravings, worn smooth by years of wear. Father Mackenzie picked it up, and it was warm in his hand, warm like someone had just taken it off. He turned it over and saw that there was an inscription inside, so small he had to hold it up to the moonlight to read it. Joseph and Catherine, May 4th, 1952. Catherine Marsh's wedding ring, the ring she'd been buried in, the ring that should have been 6 feet underground, locked in a casket, untouched for 30 years. What would you have done if you were Father Mackenzie? Would you report what you saw, or would you put the ring in your pocket and walk back to the church and kneel in the empty sanctuary and pray for understanding? He chose the latter. He never told anyone what he witnessed that Christmas Eve. Not the sheriff, not his congregation, not anyone. He kept Catherine's ring in a small box in his study, and sometimes when he performed weddings in that church, joining 2 people in marriage, promising them forever, he'd think about Michael and Sarah and wonder if forever meant something different than he'd always believed. The next morning, Christmas Day, Michael Preston was found. Not in the woods, not in some far-off place. He was in the Rosewood event barn, the place where his wedding was supposed to happen, sitting in one of the chairs that faced the altar, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed. He was wearing his wedding suit, clean and pressed, with a white rose in his lapel, and he was smiling. Not the blank, empty expression he'd worn after they found him the first time. A real smile, peaceful, complete. The paramedics who responded said he was in perfect health. No signs of exposure, no injuries, no indication he'd spent the past month and a half missing in the winter woods. He was just sitting there, warm and healthy, like he'd been waiting in that barn for a few minutes instead of 47 days. When they asked him what happened, where he'd been, he said, "I was at my wedding. Sarah and I got married. It was beautiful. They took him to county medical again. Run every test they could think of. Found nothing wrong. Physically, mentally, neurologically, Michael Preston was fine. Better than fine, actually. The psychiatrist who evaluated him, a different one this time, a man who specialized in trauma and delusion, said that Michael showed no signs of psychosis, no signs of the breakdown that had characterized his first disappearance. He was lucid, coherent, calm. He just insisted with absolute certainty that he had married Sarah Cartwright, that they'd had their wedding ceremony exactly as planned, and that she was at peace now. They both were. Michael was released after 3 days. He went home to his parents, who held him and cried and didn't ask questions they weren't ready to hear answered. And life in Millbrook Falls continued the way life always does, flowing around strange events and unexplainable moments, smoothing them over, making them into stories people tell and half believe and eventually forget. But some things don't get forgotten. Deputy Morris never stopped thinking about those footprints in the woods. 2 sets of prints, walking side by side. Pauline never returned Catherine's wedding ring after Father Mackenzie quietly left it in the Historical Society's donation box, unable to keep carrying the weight of what it meant. She put it in the case with Catherine's photos, next to the empty space where the dress used to be, and sometimes she'd see visitors stop and stare at it, like they could sense it had a story that went deeper than the small plaque could explain. Michael Preston stayed in Millbrook Falls. He went back to work at the hardware store, helped his father run the business, lived a quiet, ordinary life. He never married. When people asked why, he'd smile that same peaceful smile and say he'd already found the person he was meant to spend forever with. The way he said it made people stop asking questions. Every year on April 19th, the anniversary of Sarah's death, Michael would visit her grave. He'd bring white roses, the same kind they found in the creek, and he'd sit beside her headstone for hours, sometimes talking quietly, sometimes just sitting in silence. And every year on Halloween night, he'd walk to the Rosewood event barn and sit in that same chair, facing the altar, his eyes closed, remembering something the rest of the town could only guess at. The photographs never reappeared after that Christmas. The manila envelope stopped coming. Whatever had been documenting those strange weeks in Millbrook Falls decided the story was complete, or maybe just understood that some endings are too private to share. Sheriff Hutchins kept the photos locked away, and eventually, years later, when he retired and passed the office to Deputy Morris, he burned them in his backyard fire pit. Watching the images curl and blacken and disappear into smoke, he never told anyone why. He just said some stories needed to end, needed to be released back into the mystery they came from. The Rosewood event barn closed 2 years after Michael was found. The owners said it was for economic reasons, that there wasn't enough demand for a venue that far from the highway. But the truth, which everyone in Millbrook Falls understood without speaking, was that no one wanted to get married there anymore. The barn sat empty for years, slowly falling into disrepair, the wood graying, the roof sagging, until one night in October it burned down. No one ever figured out how the fire started. The investigation concluded it was probably electrical, probably inevitable. But the night it burned, 3 people reported seeing 2 figures standing in the field, watching the flames. A man and a woman holding hands. They were too far away to identify, and by the time anyone got close enough to ask who they were gone. Sometimes, late at night, people driving past the cemetery on Creek Road say they see lights among the headstones, small, flickering like candles burning. And sometimes, if the night is very quiet and you're listening carefully, you can hear music. Faint and distant, like it's coming from somewhere that's not quite here. Not quite now. Requiem Continue the Wedding March. Played on an organ that doesn't exist anymore in a church that's been empty for years. What do you think really happened in Millbrook Falls that autumn? Was it grief so powerful it bent reality? Was it love so strong it refused to accept death as an ending? Or was it something else entirely, something we don't have words for because we've convinced ourselves the world works in ways that are predictable and knowable and safe? Michael Preston lived to be 73 years old. He died in his sleep on a warm spring night in 2041, 47 years after Sarah's death, 47 years after the Halloween that changed everything. His mother had passed years before, his father too. He died alone in the house on Oak Street, the same house he'd grown up in, surrounded by a lifetime of memories and one photograph he kept on his nightstand. It wasn't a wedding photo, because there was no wedding photo. It was a picture of Sarah from before the accident, smiling at the camera, her dark hair catching the sunlight, looking like someone who believed she had her whole life ahead of her. The morning they found Michael, the nurse who came to check on him as part of his weekly care visits noticed something strange. The room smelled like roses, white roses, fresh ones. Even though there were no flowers in the house, no vases, no source for that sweet, unmistakable scent. And on the pillow next to Michael's head, there was a single white rose petal, perfectly preserved, like it had just fallen from a bouquet someone had been carrying. They buried Michael next to Sarah, finally. His instructions had been clear, written in his will years before, notarized and witnessed and legally binding, even though his distant cousins who inherited the estate thought it was morbid. They thought he should be buried in the family plot with his parents. But Michael's will stated explicitly he was to be buried in the Millbrook Falls Cemetery, in the plot directly beside Sarah Cartwright, and his headstone was to match hers exactly. Same style, same stone, same simple inscription, just his name and dates. Nothing else needed to be said. The funeral was small. Michael had outlived most of the people who remembered that strange autumn, and the younger generation of Millbrook Falls knew him only as the quiet man who ran the hardware store, and never quite seemed to be living in the same time as everyone else. Father Mackenzie performed the service. He was old himself by then, his hair white, his hands shaking slightly as he held the prayer book. He'd never told anyone what he saw that Christmas Eve, but standing at Michael's grave, watching them lower the casket into the ground, he finally spoke about it. Not the whole story, just enough. He said, "Michael Preston was a man who understood that love doesn't end when we think it should. He understood that some promises transcend the boundaries we place on time and existence. He waited for Sarah Cartwright with a patience and faith that most of us can't comprehend. And I truly believe that he kept his promise to her, that they had their wedding day somehow, somewhere, that they found there forever." The small crowd of mourners stood silent. Some of them cried, some of them nodded, understanding on some level that went deeper than logic. And when the service ended and people began to leave, Father Mackenzie stayed behind. He stayed until the cemetery workers filled in the grave, until the afternoon sun started to sink toward the horizon. And then he did something he'd waited nearly 50 years to do. He walked 3 plots over to Catherine Marsh's grave. The headstone was almost unreadable now, worn by decades of weather, the letters barely visible. Father Mackenzie knelt down, his old knees protesting, and he pulled a small box from his coat pocket. Inside was Catherine's wedding ring, the one he'd found in the snow that Christmas Eve, the one he'd carried with him ever since. He'd tried to give it back once, tried to leave it at the Historical Society, but it had found its way back to him. 3 times he'd left it somewhere, and 3 times it had appeared in his study, sitting on his desk, warm to the touch. He understood now. It had been waiting. Waiting for this moment, Father Mackenzie dug a small hole in the earth at the base of Catherine's headstone. Not deep, just enough. He placed the ring in the hole, covered it with soil, and said a prayer for Catherine Marsh, for Joseph Marsh, for Sarah Cartwright, for Michael Preston, and for all the people who loved so deeply that not even death could separate them. When he stood to leave, he glanced back at the 3 graves in a row. Catherine's, then Sarah's, then Michael's. 3 plots, 3 lives, 3 stories that somehow intertwined across decades in ways that defied every natural law he'd been taught to believe in. And for just a moment, just the space of a heartbeat, he thought he saw them. 4 figures standing among the headstones. Catherine and Joseph, young again, holding hands. Sarah and Michael standing close, her head on his shoulder. all of them bathed in golden light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. All of them at peace. Father Mackenzie blinked. The figures were gone. Just the graves remained, silent and still, under the late afternoon sky. He walked back to his car, his heart full of something he couldn't name, something between joy and sorrow and wonder. He never spoke of what he saw. He didn't need to. Some moments are meant to be witnessed in silence, held close, remembered in the quiet spaces between thoughts. The Historical Society eventually closed. Funding dried up, interest faded, and the building was converted into apartments for young professionals, moving to Millbrook Falls as the town slowly grew and changed. But before they cleared out the archives, before they sold off the collections and donated the artifacts to larger museums in the city, the current director, a woman named Ellen, who'd taken over after Pauline retired, found something tucked into Catherine Marsh's diary. It was a letter. Old yellowed, the ink faded, but still readable. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't signed. But the handwriting matched the entries in Catherine's diary, and the date at the top was May 3rd, 1952, the day before Catherine's wedding. The letter said, "If you're reading this, then I was right. I'm not crazy. The woman I keep seeing, the one who looks like me but sadder, older, dressed in a wedding gown that's more beautiful than mine, she's real. I don't know who she is or why she's watching me, but I think I understand now. I think she's trying to tell me something. She's trying to say that love is bigger than we imagine, that the promises we make echo forward and backward through time, that when two people pledge themselves to each other, they're not just joining their lives in the present. They're creating something that exists outside of time altogether. I'm getting married tomorrow. I'm going to marry Joseph, and we're going to have a beautiful life together. But I think, somehow in some way I don't understand, I'm also helping someone else have their wedding day. Someone who needs it more than I can explain. Someone who's been waiting in a place between living and dying, and my dress, my vows, my promise, they're a bridge. They're a way for her to cross over and finish what was interrupted. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm honored. If my wedding can somehow give another bride her chance at forever, then that's a gift. That's the most beautiful thing I can imagine. Ellen photocopied the letter before the archives were dispersed. She kept it in a frame on her wall, and sometimes, when she'd have friends over for dinner and they'd ask about it, she'd tell them the story. Not all of it, just the parts that made sense in ordinary conversation. The parts about Catherine Marsh, who had premonitions before her wedding, about Sarah Cartwright, who died before hers, about Michael Preston, who disappeared and came back claiming he'd married his dead fiancée. She'd tell it like folklore, like a local legend, and her friends would laugh nervously and say Millbrook Falls was a strange little town. But Ellen believed every word. She'd lived in Millbrook Falls her whole life. She'd been 7 years old when they found the dress in the creek. She remembered the fear that settled over the town that autumn, the way adults spoke in hushed voices and children weren't allowed to play outside after dark. She remembered seeing Michael Preston years later, a grown man by then, still carrying that peaceful, distant expression, like he was always partly somewhere else. And she remembered her grandmother, who'd been friends with Catherine Marsh, telling her once that some people are chosen to be bridges between worlds, and we should be grateful for them, even if we don't understand why they're chosen. The town of Millbrook Falls still exists. It's changed, the way all places change. The hardware store is a craft brewery now. The old diner closed and reopened as a farm-to-table restaurant. The event barn is gone, replaced by a small park with benches and a playground where children play, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The cemetery is still there, of course. Cemeteries outlast everything. And if you visit on a quiet evening, if you walk past the old oak tree and through the section where the oldest graves are, you'll find them. 3 headstones in a row. Catherine Marsh, Sarah Cartwright, Michael Preston. The stones are weathered now, the inscriptions fading, but someone still leaves flowers. White roses, always white roses, that appear on all 3 graves on the same days. April 19th, Sarah's death day. May 4th, Catherine's wedding day. And October 31st, Halloween. the night when the boundaries between worlds grow thin and love refuses to stay buried. No one knows who leaves the flowers. The cemetery caretaker has never seen anyone. Security cameras, installed after some vandalism in the early 2000s, show nothing. Just empty graves at dusk, and then in the morning footage, the roses are there, fresh and perfect, as if they grew overnight from the earth itself. Some mysteries don't need solving. Some questions don't need answers. Sometimes the not knowing is the point. The space where faith and hope and love can exist without being reduced to facts and explanations. That's what Father Mackenzie believed in his final years before he too passed and was buried in that same cemetery 4 rows over. That's what Ellen believes when she visits the graves and stands there in the silence, feeling the presence of something larger than herself. That's what Michael Preston believed when he spent 47 years waiting, working, living, but always holding space in his heart for a love that death couldn't diminish. There are people in Millbrook Falls, even now, who claim to see things on Halloween night. A woman in a wedding dress walking down Maple Street. A man in a dark suit standing by the creek where the water runs cold and deep. 2 figures holding hands in the cemetery, their faces turned toward each other, oblivious to the world around them. The sightings are rare enough that people dismiss them, common enough that they get mentioned every few years. Usually after someone new moves to town and experiences something they can't explain. The bride who came back from the grave to finish her wedding. That's how the story is told now, simplified, stripped of context, turned into the kind of tale people share around campfires and Halloween parties. They say she died before her wedding day and couldn't rest. They say she haunted the town until her groom joined her in death, and only then could they have the ceremony they'd been denied. They say if you visit the cemetery on Halloween night, you can still hear the wedding march playing. Still see them dancing in the moonlight, forever young, forever in love, forever caught in the moment they'd waited so long to reach. Is it true? All of it? Part of it? None of it? That depends on what you mean by true. The facts are documented. Sarah Cartwright died in a car accident on April 19th. Michael Preston disappeared twice and was found both times in places that didn't make sense. A wedding dress was pulled from a creek 6 months after the woman who wore it was buried. Photographs appeared that showed impossible things. A historical artifact vanished and reappeared in the woods. These things happened. People saw them, documented them, tried and failed to explain them. But the why? That's where truth becomes something more than facts. That's where you have to decide what you believe about love and death and the nature of reality itself. That's where you have to ask yourself, if love is strong enough, if a promise is sacred enough, if 2 people are meant for each other deeply enough, can they somehow transcend the boundaries we think are absolute? Can they finish what was interrupted? Can they have their forever even after time says they can't? Michael Preston believed they could. He lived his entire life on that belief, and he died with a smile on his face and the scent of roses in the air and a peace that most people search their whole lives for and never find. That has to count for something. That has to mean something. What do you think really happened that night? Share your theory in the comments, because this is the kind of story that stays with you, that you'll think about when you're alone in the dark, when you're at a wedding and the bride walks down the aisle, when you're in a cemetery and the wind moves through the trees and you could swear you hear music playing somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing. And if stories like this make your skin crawl, if they make you question what you think you know about the world, subscribe. Because there are more stories out there, more moments when reality bends and love proves to be stronger than death and the impossible becomes undeniable. They're waiting to be told. They're waiting for someone to listen, and some of them, the truest ones, the ones that matter most, might be closer to you than you think. They might be in your town, on your street, in the cemetery you pass every day without really seeing what's there. The bride who came back from the grave to finish her wedding, Sarah Cartwright, Michael Preston, Catherine Marsh. 3 people, 3 graves, 3 roses that bloom in the dark. Remember their names, remember their story, because love like that doesn't die. It just waits and waits and waits, until finally, impossibly, miraculously, it finds a way back. To finish what was started, to say the vows that were written, to have the dance that was promised, forever.